Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome to our second installment of the second sessions of Rabbi Moshe Shulman's Noahide Path meetings. He's designed these meetings to be interactive, and so it's all about the questions and the involvement. So he's holding off the class for about another 8 or 9 minutes. Hoping more people come into the Zoom room. The link is there on our Facebook advertisement. If you want to join us in the Zoom room, excellent session. I've sat in the first couple, and it's on the Rabbinic chain from Moses to today, and it's very, very uniquely put together and useful. So we want you to enjoy, but the rabbi's putting these on because he wants interactivity, and it's about us asking questions and being involved. And so I invite everybody that's watching to maybe jump into the Zoom room with us, and feel free to join us, and that way you can participate live. I know some people are shy and don't want to be advertised on the air, but we do our best to be effective in today's world. And so I'm not going to keep babbling. I'm going to let you see the Zoom session, and we'll just turn it over to Rabbi Shulman. Whenever he's ready, he'll start. So
what'll happen is I'm going to just turn on my recording, which is actually the official recording, and we'll see what happens. That was interesting. Yeah, we'll just talk together a little bit, whatever. Yeah, a few people just dropped in right after we started talking, so 7 o'clock. I'll give it 5 until about 10 after 7. We'll start there. Based on what happened earlier today, I will assume we're just going to take about an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer, depending on the questions. Had some very interesting questions that came up. And of course, that's a big part of it, is the questions you ask. Oh, I see Wendell's joining in here. That's fine. Some of our usuals here. Now, once I start the recording, I'm going to give an introduction to what we'll do. So there's no reason to do it, but just want to welcome the people I see in here. I don't see you on Facebook or on the YouTube session there. Wendell, Veronica's here. I see Veronica's here. Nice to see you. And of course, Scotty, we already talked. Anne, I guess, is Scotty. Scotty, Anne is your wife. You don't do things together? So you're told, what, is she in separate states or something like that? So, I mean, I don't want to pry into your personal family life, but
she's in another room. But
I hope everything's okay, because I never see you together. You're always apart like that.
You're trying to stir into a mess tonight, aren't you?
Just lighten the mood. That's all. Just lighten.
You're doing a very good job of it. I'm proud.
Okay, Robbie, nice to see you. I guess that's a picture. It's not live because it's not moving.
Right, it's a picture. Good to see you, Rabbi.
Yeah. Well, you see me, but I don't really see you. I just see a picture. I don't know what you look like.
Oh, I'm ugly.
Okay, Jessica, 19568. I don't know who you are, but if you want to say hello and introduce yourself, that's nice. Most of us here already, we pretty much know each other because we've been here a few times. So people get to know each other very much. Some people who are going to be listening to this, when we finally do it online, it's different. But I'm sure some of the Facebook people and the YouTube people probably know each other also. But we'll see what happens. How are we doing on Facebook and YouTube? How many people we got there now? Okay. Okay. Just to let you, 19568 apparently wishes to be anonymous. However, he told me who he is. and he's one of our old people we know. So I will respect your desire to be anonymous.
Are there any current events going on in Israel that we can talk about?
It's pretty much what's been going on for the, month or two.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go one more minute, and then I'll start with my introduction. If I yawn, don't worry, it's just because I'm tired. That construction kept me from taking a nap. It's very hard giving a class 11 and 10 o'clock last night, 11 this morning, and now a third one at 7 o'clock. So I try and take a little bit of a nap between, but unfortunately, because of the construction, they were hacking all day long. Miriam is entering. Okay. Okay. Okay, let me start the recording.
Recording in progress.
Okay, welcome everybody. We are doing the third session of, we're in the second unit, which is Noahides and Rabbis. And with the second session here, looks like this is going to start a three-parter. The subject material is basically, we're going to be tracing the tradition, the Jewish rabbinic tradition, the tradition of authority of the Jewish people. Now, remember last month, what we did in our session here is we discussed the issue of rabbinic authority. We discussed where we see it in the Torah and examples of it in the Nach. We discussed it specifically about the leaders are chosen out, who we now call rabbis, but judges, people who have the knowledge and fear of God to do it. And this was a system that was set up. We see how it went throughout the biblical times in the Tanakh. And we talked a little bit about how it goes into the beginning of the times of the Mishnah, into times of Jewish history. What we're going to do now is going to be a little bit different than that, but we're going to be building on those concepts we did there. Okay, what we're trying to do now is we're going to be taking it from the theory of what we see in the Tanakh and actually showing in real life how there's a chain of tradition, the authority and tradition that goes down from generation to generation, tracing it all the way down to our time. Now, the purpose of this is there's a couple of purposes of this. One of them is, of course, to give an understanding when we talk about the Judaism based on tradition, the oral tradition. These traditions passing down from generation to, we're going to actually go from generation to generation, showing how this exists. Also, when we get to the end, we're going to have an insight on present day Judaism, which we see today, how it actually developed to the way it is, how this fits in with the ideas we were talking about theoretically of rabbinic authority, how it deals specifically in our time today. And this, of course, will deal specifically with the Noahides. How, it's going to help you to understand who you're speaking to, what you're speaking, where it relates to the biblical authority. Now, this will help a lot because it'll give you an idea of, rabbis in general, where we're coming from, the tradition that leads to it. And also, what we're going to do is one of our sessions is going to deal, the last one, the third one, is going to deal specifically with those movements from which those people who work with Noahides are mostly taken. That is from the Hasidic world and from what we call the Yeshivish world, the non-Hasidic Litvish world. Okay, so we're going to show each one, get an idea of the differences between them, where they come from, their chains of authority also. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing here. Again, this is all going to give you background material to understand the Jewish world in general, and specifically when you're dealing with rabbis like somebody like me or somebody else, where these people are coming, and it's going to help you as to look and evaluate choosing out a rabbi for yourself and understanding who it is. And also what we're going to try doing tonight is we're going to be discussing not just the chain names of rabbis one to another, but we're going to discuss external historical events which are occurring at the time and see how these affected different places at different times and how they cause things to change. Yeah, I know. Okay, let me there was some background noise here. Okay, some background noise here. Okay, so anyways, so that's the second thing. We're trying to, we're going to be giving some historical stuff, not as a history of not specifically history of Judaism.
You're too much.
What? Okay, not as a history of Judaism class, but yeah, to see where these external events, how they influence the evolution of the Torah authority into different places. You'll see what I'm talking about as we go along, but that's one of the purposes here. Now I have divided it. We're going to be doing 3 sessions. Today's session will take us about pretty much down to the 11th century. The next one will take from the 11th century to the 20th century. And the third one will be about the Hasidic and Yeshivish world, how they developed, where they came from, and where they fit in this whole picture we're talking about more specifically. So, you see that I'm Hasidic, obviously. Sure, you may see that. But there's other Hasidim that are involved with it, especially Lubavitch. They're different, okay? And the Yeshivish world, there's a lot of people that are not Hasidic who are involved also. And so you want to have an idea where these people are coming from to sort of get an idea of what you're relating to. These, as Noahides, you sort of look on the outside of the world. And so I'm trying to get you to, people to understand. So when it comes to deciding what a rabbi is, you should know what's going on, what the world is actually, what you're trying to interact with. Okay. So that's basically that. So let's start from the beginning. What we want to start first is we want to follow the Torah tradition, the Torah authority tradition, essentially the oral law, from the time of the Torah giving to Moshe, and we'll go until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, as one sort of semi-stopping point, and then go to the actual time of the Mishnah. Then we'll take some questions along the line along the way as we go. Now, as far as the Torah tradition, in the chapters that follow as Perkei Uvos, it starts out by bringing the first important part of the tradition. It says like this, that Moshe received the Torah on Mount Sinai. This is Exodus 19:20. The Torah was given to Moshe. That's where everything starts. And it was handed over to Yehoshua. We see at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, where Yehoshua is chosen out to take the place after Moshe. So it's given on the Torah authority. Torah is handed from Moshe, goes to Yehoshua. After that, we see it goes from Yeshua to the Zakanim, the elders. Again, we see that at the end of Joshua, it talks about until the elders. Okay, the elders gave it over to the prophets. We see prophets coming on like Shmuel Nuvi. Okay, and the time of the prophets, when they give it until they gave it to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, who is the people of the Great Assembly. That occurred at the time of the Babylonian exile. So we have a tradition from Moshe all the way down there to the Babylonian exile. Okay, in Babylonia, when the first temple was destroyed, there was a change, a significant change in this oral tradition, oral authority that was given there from Moshe, from generation to generation. The oral authority changed. What happened is two things. Number one is at that time we don't see prophets. The last prophets were part of this great assembly in there. Haggai, Malachi. They were from these people who we call the Great Assembly. They came together. Okay, they were the last of the prophets. And one of the things that they did was they brought together the works that we now call the Bible. Okay, these works and many others, by the way, not just these, but many others were floating around at the time. There was, of course, the Torah, the 5 books of the Torah. That was always one. But then there were different prophets, different things like the Book of Judges, the Book of Kings, the Book of Chronicles. These were all different books that were there, written at various different times that were existent. They took together the prophecies that were important. When we talk about Noahide and the Tanakh, when we talk a little bit more about that issue of what they were doing and why they were doing it, but essentially they brought it together, and that became the Tanakh. Okay, that's the Tanakh that we have there is based on that. Books that weren't in there, even though they might have existed or written later or whatever, they were not part of the Tanakh. These were the books of the Tanakh. This is one of the things that Anshe Knesset Gedolah would do. Okay, there were a number of things that came out in Babylonia. The world had changed then, so they continued with the authority, and the authority would continue into the next time. And we'll start in 1 second. We'll get up to that. Another important thing that was done in Babylonia, by the way, was that there was a civil authority given to the house of David that was in exile. The descendants, direct descendants of the royal line back to David, they were given authority over the Jews in Persia. When Persia took it over, they were given authority over the Jews to basically judge, to rule them as their civil authority. That existed until the 11th century. So going from the time of the Babylonians until the 11th century, there was from father to son a continuation of people who were civil authorities in Babylonia. These were set communities. Okay. After that, the Jewish people returned to the land of Israel. The books of Nehemiah and Ezra talk about that they returned to the land. And with that started a chain from generation to generation of leaders. Now, this group of people came to be called the Pharisees. We'll talk about it a little bit later when we get to that. It won't be very long, but it will be in a few minutes from now. And this chain starts from the very beginning. The first person on this chain, his name is called Shimon HaTzadik. And Shimon HaTzadik was from the last people from that great assembly in Babylonia. He came to the land of Israel, and he was the first, basically, general leader at that time. Okay. After him, we have a couple of generations here. So after him was Antignos Ishlach. And this is taken from Perkei Uvos. And then Yossi ben Yochanan and Yossi ben Yoezer. And sometime around this time, we find the events around the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, interesting enough, Hanukkah has to be understood in the proper religious context, okay? We talked last time about a religious authority given to the rabbis and how it goes. And here we see the authority went down to the Anshe Knesset Goyla, gets picked up by Rabbi Shimon Tzaddik, and starting a chain inside the land of Israel. The land of Israel being fundamental to the rabbinic authority. The rabbinic authority was centered in the land of Israel from then until we'll get to it many generations later. When the situation in the land of Israel just collapsed to the point that the center of gravity or the center of Torah authority moved somewhere else. But at this time, it was moved to Israel itself. The authority was there. It was a temple. It centered around the temple and centered around Jerusalem, and that was a central authority for Judaism. The people who are in authority, these names that we said, are people that are referred to as Pharisees, but essentially we're going to see shortly that Pharisees really means rabbinic Jews. Okay, we'll get to that in a second, but we'll see that that's quite clear. However, when we talk about here at Hanukkah, what's important to remember is Hanukkah is in a sense typical for the three instances of wars that we know recurred during this period of time. There was Hanukkah, there was a revolt against Rome that led to the destruction of the temple, and the revolt against Rome by Bar Kokhba. Each and every one of these were not caused by nationalistic reason. It was not caused by a desire to set up their own country. Okay, although there were some at times who wanted to do that, and the result of Hanukkah was for a short time there was an independent kingdom. The impetus for all these actions for Hanukkah and the other ones was because the powers over the land in the time of Hanukkah was from the Greeks, Seleucid kingdom. The Greeks, they decreed that the Jewish people should stop with their religion and authority of the Torah and give it up and join the Greeks. So, for example, with Hanukkah, what happened was those who wanted to become Greeks, they brought a sacrifice of a pig in the temple. This spurred on a revolt in order to purify, in order for the Jewish people to keep the religion. From that time until before the destruction, when the Jewish people were allowed to keep the religion and they weren't persecuted, Rome allowed them to keep the Jewish religion, there were no revolts going on. There were maybe some small groups of nationalists, which Josephus talked about, but these were minor groups. The overwhelming majority of people who followed the Pharisees, as we'll see shortly, who were what we'd say the Jews of the time, the religious Jews, the Orthodox Jews of the time, they accepted that the Jewish people were under another authority, as long as this authority allowed them to practice the religion. When they did not, that's when the revolts occurred. So that's what Hanukkah was. Hanukkah was a revolt basically for the Jewish people who wanted to keep the religion. The next generation was Yeshua ben Perachia, Datayabali, and at the time was Yochanan Kohen Gouda. Yochanan Kohen Gouda was from the family of Hashmonai, which is the family of Matashui and Yehuda Maccabee, their family. That was the family of Hashmonai. And they were at the same time both kings and priests. Okay. Now, Josephus brings a story, which appears in Talmud also, that Yochanan Kohen Gouda rebelled against the Pharisees and was involved in a smaller group called the Sadducees, which started. But Josephus, we'll see shortly, makes it quite clear that the Jewish religion until that time, the religion of the Maccabees, the religion they thought was Pharisee, the Pharisees. They were the ones who had the authority, a record of authority, recognized as the authorities. So we find Josephus in book 13, chapter 10, paragraph 6. He describes the Pharisees, and the setting at this time was the time of Yochanan Kohen Gouda, who was called Hyrcanus. He had a Greek name. So he talks about how he separated from the Pharisees and became a Sadducee. But he talks about the Pharisees themselves there, the 2nd century BCE, saying, what I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the laws of Moses. So here we clearly see that in the 2nd century BCE, it was known that not only were all the people from the Maccabees and on the religious Jews, the religion of Judaism was Pharisee from that time, but also that part of the Pharisaic religion was the fact that it was known that they had customs and things, traditions that came back from their ancestors. Some went all the way back to Moses, some didn't go back to Moses. Like, for example, the holiday of Purim did not go back to Moses, obviously. It's later on. These were customs that came down to the time and are followed in today. But the important thing here, what Josephus is saying, is he's verifying that the Pharisees, like the rabbis, have the traditions that are coming down. Okay, and we see how the Pharisees become rabbis, but they have a tradition that even in the 2nd century BCE was known as a tradition that goes back to ancestors years before. Okay, so Josephus verifies the fact that what we're talking about, Jewish tradition, oral law, tradition of authority, goes down. The 2nd century BCE was known to be from further down, from ancient times. And he continues and says, basically that, you shouldn't think that these Pharisees were like a small group. But in fact, as he says, he continues, says there, but the Pharisees have the multitude on their side, meaning that the majority of the people always follow the Pharisees. Judaism and Pharisaism, or Rabbinic Judaism and Pharisaism, is essentially the same thing. And it was a religion that the overwhelming majority of people followed. And even some of the sects like the Essenes, they disagreed with the Pharisees, but they agreed in certain fundamental things. So you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Pharisees, the Essenes, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, they say that you're supposed to refrain from work a certain amount before Shabbos, which corresponds to what we know from the rabbis holding what's called Tosfos Shabbos, an adding on to the Shabbos. We find other laws like the laws of what's called mixer, things you're not allowed to touch. The Essenes have the same thing, but they disagree as to how you're supposed to implement. Almost like very similar to what we see in the Talmud, where we'll have different rabbis disagreeing about things, but agreeing on the fundamental principles underlying. Okay, and that's what's important. The Essenes agreed with the fundamental principle. There is no place in the Torah that says you're supposed to add time to the Shabbos, but that was a principle known from authority, from tradition, that comes down. We know this in the Gemara also talks about Tosfos Shabbos. So whether it's considered a biblical or non-biblical thing is a different story. But the fact is that's a tradition that doesn't appear in the text. And the Essenes also had those which fundamentally agreed with what Pharisaic Judaism is. Okay, let me bring one more passage which Josephus is talking about also. And what he says here, let me see where it starts here a second here. Yeah. He talks about by his time, there were basically 3 groups that were known. The Essenes, the Sadducees. The Sadducees, he says, were only basically the rich people who were assimilated. Okay. But the majority of people, as he's going to say here, were actually the Pharisees. Now, he talks about the Pharisees, that there are people who did not live lavish lives. They followed reason. He's writing to a Greek, Roman world, so he's putting it in the form that the Greeks and the Romans would understand what it is. So he talks about that they follow reason, and they show respect. Their morality, their ethics, and the way of life is exemplary. And he finishes discussion, and this is book 18, chapter 1, paragraph 3. It says, they are able greatly to persuade the body of the people that whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction. Insomuch that the cities give a great attestation to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and the discourses also. From this, we see 2 things. Number one, as in their lives and their living, their lives are exemplary in ethical and actions whatsoever. And secondly, that the people all follow them, no matter what. So even though we know, for example, that the many of the priestly caste who were close to the richer people had Sadducee leanings, which didn't agree with the Pharisees, in the temple itself, the temple service was followed according to the dictates of the Pharisees. There's a story that's brought in Josephus in the Talmud, where there was a priest, high priest, who was from a Sadducee, and he didn't, on the holiday of Sukkot, on Sukkot, he did not follow certain things that the Pharisees taught, which were contra the Sadducees. He did it what was the wrong way of doing it, and the people took their esrogim, their citrons, and they threw it at him. Both Josephus and the Talmud bring the same story, that because the people were Pharisees. Okay, they followed the Pharisees. Pharisees is essentially, you would say it's a synonym for rabbi in that time. Names have changed, but essentially a Pharisee was basically a synonym for rabbis. Now, the next generation after that was Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Tzetach. And following that, Atali Mishmaya. And in that generation, there was also a very famous person called Choni Hamago. Choni Hamago was a Pharisee rabbi who was known as a miracle worker. People would go for prayers for rain, such like that, and he was known to have done things. This was in that generation there. Following that generation, we come to Hillel and Shammai. So before we talk about this, let's just recognize what's happened. We've gone from Moshe to Hillel, which is basically the turn of the Common Era. Hillel died somewhere around 8 of the Common Era. Okay, we get down to there. Hillel, interesting, came from Babylonia. We should not forget, in Babylonia, there was a community there, but the center of authority was in the land of Israel. Okay, so while there were people in Babylonia living a Jewish life and following what the main source of authority was in Israel. At this time, it was in Jerusalem. It will shortly be going to different places within Israel, but still, Israel was the center of authority and of the tradition. So even though people lived in Babylonia, that wasn't where the authority was. The authority was in the land of Israel. Okay, so Hillel and Shammai lived at that time. Following Hillel, there was Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel should be somebody who's very familiar to right now because he's mentioned in the New Testament. That Gamliel in the New Testament is this Rabbi Gamliel, who was a leader. We'll see pretty soon. Josephus actually mentions him. Okay. Now, at this time, in Egypt, in Alexandria, there was a well-known Jewish philosopher from there. His name was Philo. And Philo, if you read his stuff, you find out that he also ascribes himself to the Pharisees. Although, again, in Egypt, they were Jews who were, living in a Greek atmosphere. So they didn't have the kinds of skills in Hebrew. They learned things in Greek. Much as we find, for example, a lot of people in America, they can't learn in Hebrew as much, so they learn in the English. Okay? Philo was the same way that. And Philo, if we would project him into today's date, would be similar to the Jewish, Orthodox Jews who go to a place like Yeshiva University, where they learn both rabbinic and secular studies at the same time. It's a mixture of both. So Philo was like that. We see Philo when he discusses the biblical text. His main purpose of the biblical text was to show, to show to the Gentile world, the Greek and Roman world, that the Torah is not in contradiction to the intellectual world of his time. But in it, he talks about many things. He brings one particular teaching that he has there, which is very similar to what we find in rabbinic literature. You see, it says, he asked the question, why was it Adam was created after all the animals? And he says the reason is because Hashem wanted to prepare his meal, what he should eat before that, so he should come to everything set and prepared for him. There's similar midrashim that appear along these lines in rabbinic midrashim. So we see that these ideas, and Philo ascribes this to the people who are knowledgeable about the law, similar language that Josephus used for the Pharisees. So we see a Pharisaic type of teaching in Philo ascribed to the people most knowledgeable, similar to what Josephus says, that the most knowledgeable people are the Pharisees. So we see how Philo is essentially associated with the Pharisees. Pharisaic Judaism is essentially Judaism at the time. Okay? we don't need to look anywhere else except to just look at the New Testament. Invariably, when we see the discussions in the New Testament, who is Jesus talking to? The Pharisees. Sadducees never seem to be around. The Sadducees are virtually never mentioned there's, I think, one or two instances, some of you can correct me if wrong, there's maybe one or two instances where the Sadducees are mentioned, and it's basically like just pushing away, like, these guys don't know what they're talking about. Paul, when he says who he is, his credentials, what's his cred to be talking, he's a Pharisee. He's somebody who's knowledgeable. And even more than that, he says he learned it by Gamliel. Right? This is the Gamliel we're talking about now. Now, interesting enough, Josephus talks about this Gamliel also. So before I go on to that, get to that point, there's one thing I want to mention. One of the people who lived at the time of Rabbi Gamliel, the first one, who's in the New Testament, was Yonasan ben Azil. Yonasan ben Azil is very well known because he translated into Aramaic most of the Nach. So if you look at the Tanakhs that you have, talking about the Nevi'im portions, you see a translation, you see Targum Yonasan, the translation of Yonasan. Yonasan at that time lived in the period just before the destruction of the temple. Okay? Now, in the generation of the destruction of the temple, we find a number of important rabbis. Shimon ben Gamliel, that's Gamliel who we spoke before, his son. And the second, I'm going to talk about him with Josephus, because Josephus mentions him and again gives us more information supporting the idea of Gamliel. Secondly, there was Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived at the time of destruction, and also after the destruction was very important to the actual destruction. And the third person, again, I want to mention is another one of these rabbis who is known for doing miracles, Hanina ben Dosa. Hanina ben Dosa was at that time. Now, Josephus had wrote an autobiography. And in his autobiography, he writes about himself. He was a leader during the rebellion in the Galilee. And he had some political opponents of his. And these political opponents, what they did is they sent to Jerusalem to complain about him to Shimon ben Gamliel. That is our Shimon ben Gamliel in the Talmud, we're talking about here now. And if you want to doubt that, he talks about who this person was. This Shimon was of the city of Jerusalem and of a very noble family of the sect of the Pharisees, which are supposed to excel others in accurate knowledge of the laws of our country. Here, essentially, he's describing our Shimon ben Gamliel, Gamliel there being the supposed teacher of Paul, who we know from before died in 48. Now, the Shimon ben Gamliel was actually executed during the revolt against Rome. He died around 68. He was executed then. The other person that I mentioned here, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he actually lived through the revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem. With the destruction of Jerusalem, we come to the end of a certain period, in that until that time, from the time when the Jewish people came back from exile in Babylonia and Persia, the center of Jewish authority was in the city of Jerusalem, where the temple was and the rabbinic authority, they were in the same place. With the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the leader after Shimon ben Gamliel, he gathered together whatever rabbis were left and brought the authority in Yavna, which is another part of Eretz Yisrael, but it starts with Israel. So still in Israel, Israel is still the center of authority and of the tradition, but not in Jerusalem. So with the destruction of the temple, there was a disruption in the authority, but it just moved a short distance away, moved to Yavna, didn't leave Israel. Okay, this is very important. We're going to find out a little bit later, a few hundred years later, the importance of why the authority stayed there and didn't go anywhere else. But at this time, we see the authority is still in the land of Israel. Okay, let's take a break for a couple minutes. I want to, the next section here, talk about the rabbis who make up the primary rabbis in the mishna. Okay, and starting from those actually after the destruction of the temple, although rabbis from before the destruction of the temple are mentioned, but I want to specifically talk about rabbis from the destruction of temple, and Ben Zakkai, and further until the Mishnah gets written down. So let me just take a minute or two. If you have questions, now is the time to raise your hand and we will try and address them before going on. Rabbi.
What? I got a couple of questions, but the Tanakh, was it a set of scrolls that people would keep in a bin, and they would pull out like the scroll of Jeremiah and read it, or was it in a book?
Yes. In fact, we have what's called the Haftarah. The Haftarah came about because it was a certain time when it was forbidden for the Jews to read the Torah itself. So what they did is they took from the works of the prophets in different areas where the subject matter sort of hinted at what the weekly parsha was. And there are people, even till today, read it from a special scroll, not from a book, from a scroll. The common custom is like in my community, they read it from a book, or they might put it into a book, collecting together all the different haftarahs. But there are some people who actually read it from a scroll, because these were scrolls.
Okay, this is another question. What Jewish year did the Tanakh come out?
Oh, I don't. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah,
I'd have to look it up. I'm doing mostly in secular because it sort of helps as far as discussing historical events. But
it would come out at different times according to the way the prophets came out, wouldn't it?
well, the books were written at different times. Yes,
Yeah.
obviously, Isaiah was written hundreds of years. Right.
But that was after the last three prophets.
Correct. I mean, the Malachi and Haggai were alive at the time. So we're talking about the end of the time where prophecy was actually ending. Okay. The last prophets were a part of those people who chose out which books should be in. But yes, it's pretty much at the end of it.
Yeah, but we don't right off know the year.
Well, no, I'd have to look up when they actually the time. I didn't do it. I'm not giving a history lesson here. What I'm trying to do only is give a sort of an understanding of, since we're into this concept of rabbinic authority, how that rabbinic authority has devolved to us today. Okay. Right. And for that, we have to go through history. Okay. Yeah. And many certain historical events like destruction of the temple, both the first and the second, had impacts on this authority. So the destruction of the first temple, people went to Babylonian exile, and there they had to reconstruct, construct the authority. When they came back to the land of Israel, things were moved to Jerusalem, and there was, until the second temple was destroyed, and they went to Yavne. We're going to follow a little bit more about how this goes around until we get to now that this rabbinic authority is in New York and Israel. How do we get from there to here? And that's what we're going to try and do to show where this rabbinic authority, how it devolves into different places. We're going to get pretty close to that in this session today, because we're going to get up to the 11th century. And next time, we're actually go how the devolution goes onto different areas and how this affects our understanding of rabbinic, of the authority from biblical authority. Okay, Veronica, why don't you ask your question?
Okay, this kind of goes back to what you were saying, that there's some events, like Purim, that are not in Torah, and I'm wondering, how did it come about that did somebody just say, oh, let's have a celebration for Purim, did the rabbis all get together and say, okay, that's, and would it happen today? I mean, is there something that would trigger making an event an annual celebration or whatever? Does that make sense?
That's an interesting question. Again, this is all tied in with rabbinic authority. Your question about today, let's discuss that later, because you don't understand. We haven't gotten to understand what rabbinic authority is today as opposed to what it was then. When they were in Babylonian exile, they realized that the events around Purim were different, more significant they had a spiritual and effect on things that was so important it had to be remembered from ages, just like Hanukkah. Hanukkah, where the Jewish people got together and miraculously Hashem assured that our Torah traditions would exist. They would not be taken over by the Greeks. That was significant enough that we should remember from generation to generation. Purim is about when the nations tried to destroy the Jewish people as a whole, and Hashem did not allow that. Hanukkah is about where the nations tried to destroy Jewish Torah observant, and Hashem didn't allow that. These two types of attacks on the Jewish people are continual. Okay, whether it's trying to wipe us out as a people physically, or whether they want to wipe us out as a religion, both of these exist. And these two holidays that the rabbis instituted is to remind us of that. And we will find, sadly enough, that when we go about Jewish history in relationship to Torah authority, we're going to see how this actually plays it out again and again and again throughout the exile. Okay, we've only come to a little bit here with what we've talked about now, the destruction of the Second Temple. Remember, the Second Temple was destroyed because the revolt started because the Romans at that time wanted to stamp out the Jewish religion. Okay, just like Hanukkah. They lost the war, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was wise enough to know, let's reinstitute the institutions we had in Jerusalem in Yavna and continue from there. So they kept this chain going on. I hope that gives an explanation of that. Okay, let's move on. We want to go up from now to get up to the Mishnah. Okay, so the first generation after the destruction, we had Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and after he passed, the authority went to Rabbi Gamliel, who was a grandson of the other Gamliel, and Eliezer ben Azariah. There were two people who were of equal authority. There's a whole story in the Talmud about it, which I'm not going to get to it, but basically the authority was balanced between two. In that time, there was Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Hoshua, who was the Rabbi Hoshua that we talked about, who had disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel. We talked about the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah and how Rabbi Shua followed Rabbi Gamliel because he was the leader of the generation. That's that Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Tarfon is another person in that generation. Some people believe that Origen, who wrote his book of a disputation with a rabbi, Trypho, that's Rabbi Tarfon. I'm not really sure that that's the case, but I mention him only because you might find that mentioned someplace. That's when he lived. He lived in this time, the first generation after destruction. The second generation after destruction, we're talking about the beginning of the early parts of the 2nd century CE. We find Rabbi Akiva was the leader of the generation. There was a Rabbi Shmuel who's also important. And also at that time lived Onkelos, the convert, Onkelos Ager. The Aramaic translation of the Torah that we know of, the Targum Onkelos, was from Onkelos who lived at that time. Okay, that's who he was. Rashi brings many times from Onkelos. It's the standard Aramaic translation that we find of the Torah. Okay, now let's go back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is very important for two reasons. Number one, as far as the Torah tradition, the chain of Torah, Rabbi Akiva is a focal point. His Talmud was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir's Talmud was Rabbi Huda Nasi, who we're going to find out put together the Mishnah. The Gemara makes it clear that the Mishnahs from Rabbi Meir, from Rabbi Huda Nasi, comes from Rabbi Meir according to what he learned from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is essentially our source. He was a Talmud from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. His chain goes all the way back before him, and from him comes a chain all the way back to what is in our Mishnah. That is authoritative to the chain of authority. The Mishnah is basically the views that were raised by the authorities as to what the law is supposed to be. But we see the tradition going from Rabbi Akiva all the way down to the actual Mishnah itself. Okay, that is fundamentally what the importance is of Rabbi Akiva as far as we're concerned. Rabbi Akiva is the one who is the source for the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the source of the Talmud is the source of everything that comes after it. It all goes back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Kiva was a Talmud of Rabbi Zakkai, and with Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He was from the Talmudim and the students of them. So it goes all the way back. The second thing of importance, of course, was Rabbi Kiva was in the time of the Bar Kokhba. Rabbi Kiva thought that the Bar Kokhba could have been Mashiach. Unfortunately, that was not the case. But the Bar Kokhba revolt was very important. Under Hadrian, the emperor, he instituted a number of restrictions. Judaism, I think circumcision was one of them, trying to suppress the Jewish religion. This was a catalyst for a revolt. The revolt in Roman literature, forget about the Jewish literature, Roman literature considered this extremely serious, to the point that when the emperor would go before the Senate every year, he would always start his speeches saying, Rome and its people, everything's fine with Rome. During the revolt under Hadrian, he didn't say that. He was forced to send many legions to fight, to suppress the Bar Kokhba revolt. There were many disastrous results from that. One of them was that basically the Jews were thrown out of Jerusalem. After the destruction of the temple, Jews could live in Jerusalem. But after Bar Kokhba, they were thrown out. More people went to exile in Italy and eventually ended up in Germany and places like that. But the Bar Kokhba revolt was actually in many ways much worse than the destruction of the temple as far as the effect on the people in the land of Israel. All right. Again, things continued, but things were beginning to start going downhill. Okay, so the next generation after Rabbi Kiva, we find Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir taught a number of rabbis who were of extreme importance. One was Rabbi Eliezer, one was Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. These are the rabbis that are the conduit for the next generation. And Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai should be a name you should know, because he is the source of the Jewish tradition that comes into the Zohar. So the Zohar goes back to him. That's the Jewish mystical teachings go back to him. He's buried in the city of Meron. The generation of Rabbi Meir was Rabbi Yehuda Nussi, was also one of his talmidim. And among the other people living at that time was Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, Shimon bar Yochai's son Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yehuda. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Nussi was the one who compiled the Mishnah. And it's very important to understand, why was the Mishnah compiled at that time? The reason it was given is because Rabbi realized that if it wasn't written down, the situation in Rome, what was going on with the people living in Israel, there was a serious chance that all of this learning, which was done orally, would be lost. So Rabbi Yehuda Nussi wrote it down. Rabbi Chia wrote down extra teachings that were not written down by Rabbi, but other than called brises. It was written down. And this brings to an end a period of time. Those rabbis from the Mishnah, we call a rabbi from the Mishnah, a Tana, meaning somebody who teaches. Somebody from the next generation, which is starting with the Talmud, or the rabbis from the Talmud, they're called a Mamoyer, someone who says something. Okay, there was a fundamental understanding at this time that things were going on in the world around there in Israel, which made it impossible to continue as it was. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Nussi lived, he died somewhere around 195. His son, Rabbi Gamliel ben Rabbi, and Rabbi Shia ben Levi are basically the next generation, but it's still the very end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was compiled sometime around 188 CE of the Common Era, the very end of the 2nd century. But what's important to recognize is what Rabbi was seeing was what's going on in the Roman Empire. Marcus Aurelius, going against what the tradition had been of choosing out the best person to take over him, left over his son to be the emperor, and the son was not worthy of it. The son was not a father like his father. His father was a philosopher, somebody who was a personage of importance, whereas his son Commodus was not. Commodus was assassinated. That brought in the year of the 5 emperors, followed by another 20, 30 years, which had 5 or 6 emperors. And then following with that, in the 3rd century, was basically considered the years of tribulation, because the Roman Empire was basically tottering, and they were constantly changing who was the emperor during that period. This was a time of total disaster. Okay, so Rabbi stepped in at that time before it actually took place in order to write down the Mishnahs, because around him he saw that the world was changing. And with this change, the level of learning, the level of things, because the world was so crazy going around them in the Roman Empire at that time, they were not able to be on the same level as the previous generations. It's not a question of being smart, it's a question of the social situation changed so significantly and was so unsettling that the ability to continue on the high level that it was from the rabbis and Mishnah was no longer there. Okay, and this ends the period of the Mishnah with Rabbi. And again, the historical background of what's going on there is that the Roman Empire is basically in turmoil. It's going to lead to the time of the Talmud, where we're going to see that slowly the center of gravity for Torah authority starts moving from Israel to Babylon. And we'll get to that shortly. It starts moving from Israel to Babylonia, so that Babylonia starts becoming the center until the 11th century. We'll take a break for a minute, and then we'll start in the Talmud. But what's important to remember now is with Rabbi writing the Mishnah, the reason why the Rabbi Mishnah was because the Roman Empire was beginning to fall apart. There was constant changes in the empire. There was constant turnovers. Constantly, the empire was just in constant tribulation and turning over. There was no stability. And this lack of stability meant it was difficult in order to maintain the type of system that was going on before that. Okay, so let me take a break a second, and we'll go on to the Talmud. Oh, by the way, any questions?
Actually, I have a I should know this. Where is Babylonia in the curve?
Babylonia is essentially Iraq.
Okay, thanks.
Some of the cities that we talk about are actually now in Iran, but Iraq is actually where Babylonia is. Iran is where other cities are. Shushan is in actually Iran, where the story of Esther took place. And the yeshivas that we're going to talk about here, we talk about Babylonia because of Babylonian exile, not because of that Babylonia. The exile is they're really in Persia. Okay, any more questions? Dana, do you see any questions in any of these groups? I don't know. I didn't ask you last time. Dan? Okay. Okay, so let's go on to the Talmud. Now, as I mentioned, rabbis in the Mishnah are called Tanuim, teachers, people who taught Tana, teaching. The rabbis of Talmud are called Amarum, the sayers, the repeaters. Fundamentally, the difference is like this. A rabbi from the time of the Talmud no longer has the authority to argue against a rabbi from the period beforehand. So if a Tana in the Mishnah says something, a rabbi from the Talmud cannot say that rabbi is wrong. What he can do at most is say that this applies to a certain instance. I'm talking about different instance, or there's another rabbi, another Tana who says this, or I have another teaching from that time that disagrees, and they'll argue about that. The Talmud is filled with these kinds of arguments. But fundamentally, as far as the issue we're talking about authority, the authority of an Amoida in the Talmud is inferior to the authority of a Tana. Okay? So the first generation, and there's another thing we have to understand, whereas in the Mishnah, all of the teachers in the Mishnah were in Israel. Okay? When we get to the Talmud, we find that the center of gravity of Torah authority is moving from Israel to Babylonia. So we start getting rabbis from Babylonia who are authoritative. Again, they're not Tanoim, except when we have one exception here that comes in. They don't have the authority of the rabbis of the Mishnah, but the center is now moving towards Babylon. Okay, so the first generation we have here, we have 4 people I'm going to mention here, 2 in Babylonia and 2 in Israel. The first ones in Babylonia are Rav and Shmuel. They are the big ones in discussions. Rav is very interesting because he proves the rule that I'm trying to talk about. In the Talmud, it refers to Rav as Rav Tana Ipale. It says Rav is supposed to be considered like he's a Tana, even though from the Mishnah rabbis. He's supposed to be considered like a rabbi from the Talmud, from the Mishnah, and he can disagree with another Tana. This is the special status that Rav has, where the person who disagrees with Shmuel is not that case. They disagree with each other. But Rav is considered of a bit of a higher level. He's like a bridge between the 2 generations, but proves the point that I'm trying to say, that there was a recognition that after the Mishnah was closed, the rabbis coming after do not have the power to argue against it, with that one exception that I mentioned with Rav. Now, the third of the 4th rabbis, Rabbi Yochanan, these make up a trio. Rav, Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan. You will many times find in the Talmud where it says, Rav says this, Shmuel says this, and Rabbi Yochanan says this, all arguing together. The difference, however, is Rabbi Yochanan was in Israel. And his number 1 Talmud, who's very important also, is Reish Lakish. Many times the Gemara told Rabbi Yochanan says this, Reish Lakish argues against it. Reish Lakish is an interesting personality. He started in his youth, he was actually a robber. Rabbi Yochanan found him. They came together. There's a story. He actually ended up marrying Rabbi Yochanan's sister, and he became the number 1 student of Rabbi Yochanan, to the point that when Rabbi Yochanan teach, Reish Lakish would bring multiple arguments against him. Rabbi Yochanan considered him his greatest scholar. Reish Lakish died. The Gemara thinks a very interesting thing about that they were arguing in the Beis Medrash, Rabbi Yochanan, an issue about knives. And Reish Lakish disagreed with Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan said, well, you should be knowledgeable about knives, hinting at his background of being a robber at one time. And Reish Lakish was very taken by that, and he actually died from it. And Rabbi Yochanan also was very, very hurt from the whole thing, what he did. But it's an interesting story on the side, not relevant for what we're talking about. Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are from the rabbis in Israel. They're fundamental in the Talmud. But what we're seeing now is the first generation of the rabbis in the Talmud. We have rabbis in Israel, and we have rabbis in Babylonia. The second generation is with Rav Chiz and Rav Shmuel ben Nachmani. They are in Babylonia. We don't have any major names that I found from in Israel at that time. There were, but not ones that are in names. Now, I forgot something. Rav, what he did, which was most important and significant, Rav founded the yeshiva in the city of Sura. Sura is in Persia. He founded that yeshiva. That yeshiva existed off and on until the 11th century. So you should remember the city of Sura is going to be very, very important, okay, when we deal with the center of Jewish authority, rabbinic authority, okay? After Rav Chiz and Rav Shmuel ben Nachmani, we have the next generation, which is Rabbi in Babylonia and Rabbi Zera and Rabbi in Israel. However, Rabbi Zera went from Israel to Babylonia. So there's many times the Talmud say that Rabbi Zera when he came from the west, meaning when he came from the land of Israel to Babylonia, he taught such and such and such. This is indicating to us something that should be aware of. The center of Torah authority was at this time moving from the land of Israel towards Babylonia. What was the reason for it? Well, when we get this time, we're talking about in the middle of the 3rd century. The 3rd century in Rome was a time of absolute disaster. Following that, we would have the reunification. In the 4th century, we have the Christians and the Christian persecution and forced conversions that would be in the 4th century. We're going to get to those shortly. So at this time, things are starting to move because people are seeing that life in the land of Israel is becoming very difficult as far as maintaining the Torah authority, Torah things. Whereas in Persia, it was better. Okay. Now, in the time of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera, in Babylonia, there was founded the yeshiva of Pumbedisa in 257. Now, besides Sur and Pumbedisa, there was another yeshiva that had existed I was not able to find out exactly when it started in the city of Nahardua, but that was destroyed in the year of 259. It'll come back later. Eventually, it'll come back in the story again. But just remember, mainly the Sira, Pamadisha, and Nahardua. Okay, Sira and Pamadisha are historically more important as centers of Torah learning, centers of Torah authority. Okay, but as we see now, the authority is moving from the land of Israel in the various cities after Jerusalem, and moving in authority is moving to Babylon. Okay, so now let's go to the next generation after Rabbah. That's Abai and Ruva. The Abai and Ruva are fundamental in the Talmud. In fact, so fundamental are they is that when we refer to Talmudic learning, we talk about the discussions of Abai and Ruva, because they're all over the place. It's essentially their discussions which start the formation of Talmud. Abai and Ruva were the ones who started bringing together the Talmud in Babylonia. It took a while until it was actually done, but they were the impetus of it. However, what happened is we're now in the middle of the fourth century, and in Babylonia we have the rabbis Rav Kahana and Rav Kopa, very important rabbis. I mentioned a lot of time. Rav Kahana is famous for his. We know now he wrote Midrashim, Psikta Rav Kahana, which were actually sermons talking on the weekly teaching portions and stuff like that, with a lot of midrashic teachings, very important. Okay, Rav Kopa appears there also a lot, and also Rabbi Hillel, a descendant of Hillel, is the last major rabbinic figure in the land of Israel. This takes us up to the year of 350. By that time, the Roman Empire had become Christian, and it was not tolerant like the Romans were. And there were persecutions of the land of Israel. There were forced conversions. And basically, it was in the cards that the authority that was having Israel is going to end. So this led to two events happening in this time. Number one is the Yerushalmi Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, was compiled at this time. There wasn't work on it as much with the Babylonian Talmud, so you find that the arguments there are much shorter. The language is different. The Babylonian Talmud is in Aramaic that's spoken more towards the east, and the Jerusalem Talmud is the Aramaic spoken towards the west, slightly different than that. But everything is much shorter. The arguments are much shorter. They don't have the type of advanced discussions in length as you find in the Babylonian Talmud. And essentially it's because the situation was deteriorating so quickly in the land of Israel, they had to compile together what they had. And remember, the Talmud is a discussion of the Mishnayos by the rabbis in that area. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, you find only rabbis from Israel, whereas in the Babylonian Talmud, you find rabbis from both places, because it was the influence from coming from the west to the east that gets incorporated into the Babylonian Talmud. That's one of the reasons why we follow the Babylonian Talmud as opposed to Jerusalem Talmud, because Jerusalem Talmud did not have as much expansive discussion about these issues as the Jerusalem Talmud does. So there are some differences. That was the first thing. The second thing is, as far as today's concerned, it is probably more important. Now, we talked about how this, from the time the Jewish people went back to the land of Israel, the center of authority was in the land of Israel. Now, this implied a couple of things. One of the things that was implied is that we all know that the Jewish calendar setting up the holidays is based on the lunar calendar. Now, the lunar calendar, the beginning of the month starts when there is a new moon. So how do you do that? We talked last time about the argument about in Tractate Rosh Hashanah as to when the new moon was declared. We find from there, we see that in Jerusalem, they would declare when the new moon would be. The court given the authority, the ones who had the authority declared what it is, and that's what it would be. But with the 4th century and the persecutions coming from the Christians, which was decimating the Jewish community there, the number of rabbis who would be able to do that were getting small enough, and they could see basically the handwriting on the wall. In fact, Rabbi Hillel is the last major rabbi that we know of who was like a Israeli born, okay, if you want to put it that way, was born from there, who we know of in authority, until we get to the Ottoman Empire. which Ottoman Empire is the 15th century, where after they conquered Constantinople, they allowed Jews being exiled from Spain to come in. Until that time, while there were Jewish communities there, these Jewish communities were not strong as far as Torah authority was concerned. There were rabbis and people who were knowledgeable, but they weren't on the level that had already moved away. Now it's moving to Babylonia. We'll see how it moves to other places. But they weren't of the authority that they had. So Rabbi Hillel was actually the last one. And so they had a problem. What are they going to do about declaring the beginnings of each month? It had to be done in Israel. That's where it had to be done from. It couldn't be done outside of Israel. So how could it be done? So Rabbi Hillel sat down and they calculated when the new moon would be for the future. And so if you look, they have what's called the moilid, when the new moon occurs, and they have it down to even parts of a second. It's phenomenally accurate. And until this day, they use it. He said not only what that was, he declared which days are going to be the first day of the months until our time. We follow that today. And he what we call it was Makadish. He declared that these days are now the days that are officially the days of the first of the month. And he did it for all the time in the future. Using, again, the rabbinic authority that he had. And we live according to that today. When you talk about when Passover is going to be, when you talk about Purim is coming up. Why isn't Purim now? Why is it a month later? Because we have an extra a month. All of these were because Rabbi Hillel, recognizing the situation of what's going on, that the ability for the rabbis in Israel to make the new moons was disappearing. They sat down, the court sat down, and they were set the days which would be the new moon based on the calculations when the new moon would occur and other reasons. And we have charts and things. It's extremely complicated. It's so complicated I don't really understand. I never spent the time to learn it, but it's an extremely complicated thing. And that was set by Hillel. Why? Because he was recognizing that the authority from Israel was declining and disappearing. And as it was disappearing, we see that the center of gravity of Torah authority had been moving to Babylonia. So by that time, I use Babylonian, but really we should say Persia maybe, was moving to there into Persia. Okay? Now, after Rabbi Hillel, we have only rabbis from Babylonia. There were no longer any rabbinic authorities in the land of Israel. All the authority was in Babylonia. So the next generation after Rabbi Hillel is Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi is extremely important in the Talmud. His son Marba Rav Ashi and a Talmud Rafram were basically the last rabbis of the Talmud in Babylonia. And around the year 500, the Babylonian Talmud was completed. And the reason why it was completed then, we're going to see, is because even in Persia, the situation started to become unstable. So they had to write down the Talmud. So here we come to the end of the period of the Talmud, where, again, we're seeing that because of external situations in the land of Israel, because of Christian persecution, the authority of the rabbis was basically cut off and transferred over to Babylonia. And in Babylonia also there were problems, meaning that they could not keep orally what was in the Talmud. They had to write it down because of the Persians' persecutions that were starting to occur. So this takes us to around the year 500 and the end of the writing of the Talmud. So let me stop for a minute now, take a drink, and open up for any questions that there might be. Dan, please take a look if there's other questions other places. And then after that, we're going to. Well, becoming a rabbi depends on learning. Okay, becoming Jewish is a different story. It's mentioned in the Talmud what you have to do. Basically, you have circumcision and immersing in a mikveh. but before they accept you, you have to make sure you can accept all the laws. This is brought down. There's a tractate called Tractate Geonim, which this is called a minor tractate, the tractate on converts. It's one of the minor tractates. This is going to be written down after the Talmud. We're going to mention that shortly. It's in the next period from the 6th to the 7th century is when these minor tractates get written down based on, and stuff is in the Talmud in different places, but it's really brought there together. A person become a rabbi from learning. Learning was open to anybody, and if you reach a certain level of learning, then you would be a rabbi. Rabbi Akiva's the curriculum was to learn everything, and if you were knowledgeable, then you were, you would be considered a rabbi. And if you were, until you got to that age, and some people were there are many people in the Talmud who are not called rabbi. Ben Azai, okay, Ben Zayman, were not called rabbi, but they appear in the Talmud, and their views are seriously taken in the Talmud because they were very learned. They just weren't considered. There was something that was called smicha that was given, but that disappeared over time. Essentially, smicha was a recognition that you were knowledgeable, but it was all based on being knowledgeable. It's not, you didn't go to a school and get a certificate that said that you learned certain studies of that. You had to be really knowledgeable, and knowledgeable in the sense of not just like Ben Zayman and was a very knowledgeable person, but he never got smicha because he didn't reach that level of knowledge. Okay, but he was knowledgeable enough that the Talmud mentions him. Okay, we're going to talk about rabbis and what it actually means in the future. That's very important. It's part of what we discuss about Noahide and rabbis, because you have to know what it means. There are rabbis and there are rabbis, and there are people who are rabbis who don't know anything. People who are not rabbis officially, who know a lot more than people who are rabbis. We're going to talk about that, what that really means. Okay. Essentially, what we're trying to do now is to talk about and understand that with the closing of the Babylonian Talmud, this occurred because, again, external events indicated that it was necessary to write down the text of the Talmud so it could be saved for later generations. So they would have these discussions available to them because they wouldn't be able to be orally handed down. They would have to have them written. Okay. Essentially, what we're seeing is that Judaism is coming from an oral tradition into basically a written tradition, where we consider things written as part of our oral tradition, because when we talk about oral tradition, we're really talking about rabbinic authority in each generation. Whether it's passed down orally or written, it really doesn't make a difference. It's the authority that goes down. And so these written things, even though we refer to, written works that we'll see later on as part of the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral law, it's oral law because what it is based on rabbinic authority outside of, just directly the text. As Josephus says, these traditions that they had that were not written explicitly in the book of the Torah itself. Okay, that's what we mean by oral law, essentially. These things that were outside of there, whether, wherever they came in, whether like Hanukkah or Purim, which came in well after the time of Moses, but were part of the oral tradition, part of our tradition, that's all part of it. It's really essentially rabbinic authority. What the authorities say are what we're supposed to follow from that time, based on what we talked about last time. But again, once we get to the end of the Talmud, we find, again, a recognition that something has changed. Fundamentally, has changed in quality from what happened before and what's happening now. Okay? The Talmud was ended and written down because it was realized that something was fundamentally changing. Okay? So that's why we're now entering a new period. Just like the time of the Talmud, Talmudim was a new period because they recognized that we're no longer in the same level as the rabbis of the Mishnah. So now we're at the level that was the Talmud. Now that the Talmud is being closed because of the disturbances going on in the outside world, the people learning then were no longer considering themselves on the same level as those before them. Okay, it's very important in Judaism to understand that Judaism is that way. We recognize our limitations in comparison to previous generations. It's not that we're smarter than them or less smarter than them. It's because we don't live in the type of a society where we can learn on the level that they learn because of what has changed around us. This time, Israel had collapsed as a center of Torah learning, as a center of authority. It moved to Babylonia. But even in Babylonia, there were problems because of the Persians. There was instability there. Okay. If there are no more questions, I will continue to the next part. Yes, I know Gabriel's here. I didn't want to say anything. He's up way up past his bedtime, unless he's actually got up early in the morning. I don't know which one it is. Okay, so the next period of time, covering the next approximate 2 centuries, is a period of time called the Rabbinic Savarua. Now, what did they do? The Talmud was essentially finished. But in the Talmud itself, the text itself was written down, but it was very difficult to work with. They didn't have it broken up. The mishnas weren't put in such a way so that we were going to. They basically fixed up, they tidied up the work of the Talmud. So it comes into the form that, Gabriel says he might be in New York. Okay, well, if he's in New York, he should come visit me. Okay, the format of the Talmud was being put into the order that it was supposed to be. So like now, if you open up the Talmud, you see it says a Mishnah, and following the Mishnah is like two points, and a few words from the Mishnah, 2 points again, and then the discussing, or some 2 points here. There's a lot of little editorial type things. That's what they were doing. They also added the minor tractates, like we mentioned the tractate on converts. This came together at that time also. Again, based on teachings there before, but it all comes. This is what they did over that period of time. But it was a period of time in which there was a lot of upheavals. It covered the period of about 5 generations, but in the beginning of it, it started off with the Persians closing the yeshivas of Sur and Pumbedisa. Okay, they had to be reopened later on. So, for example, in the year 530, the yeshiva in Ardua opens up again. In 589, the yeshiva in Pumbedisa opens again, and in 609, yeshiva in Sura opens up again. In 660, Nahardua joins together with Pumbedisa. So we end up, by the end of this period of time, having 2 main yeshivas, the yeshiva in Sura and the yeshiva in Pumbedisa. But all this time is they're clarifying the Talmud text, and there's just total social chaos there. The communities were still able to hold together. The yeshivas were closed, but they were opened up again. It was a very difficult time. To the end of it, we have, of course, the Arab conquest of the area. And a little bit of stability comes in after this. So from the end of the 7th century, we're talking about, say, 690, until 1040, there's stability. Okay? A relative stability. Okay? This relative stability is the age of the geonim. It goes from about 690 to 1040. Okay? And this is an important thing. The center of gravity for Torah authority has moved from the land of Israel to Babylonia. It was done beforehand. There were a lot of problems there, but eventually it stabilizes so that Babylonia has now become the center of gravity for Torah authority and Torah tradition. Okay? And the Torah tradition authority is based around the 2 yeshivas that were in, again, I say Babylonia, but it's really in Persia, the yeshivas of Sur and Pumbedisa. The heads of the yeshiva were called the geonim. So there's the geonim of Sura and the geonim of Pumbedisa. And these will go on for generations until the 11th century, when they get closed based on some outside historical events that we're going to talk about. Okay? Now, there were a number of people over this, almost 400-year period of time that we could mention, but I only want to choose out a few of them because this is not a class in Jewish history. This is a class in Torah authority, the chain of Torah authority, how we get to today. So we've now got the authority in Babylonian 2 yeshivas, and that's going to go down until the yeshivas are closed in the year 1040, and we're going to see something else happens after that. But again, centralized authority still exists up until that time. Okay, we still have a place. It wasn't Israel anymore; it was in Babylonia, but we still had a central authority around the two yeshivas, Sur and Pomadisa, and the heads of these yeshivas are called the geonim, and this is the period of the geonim, and this is again the Torah tradition is going through there. Now, I'm going to only mention 5 geonim from these two yeshivas, although there are many, many more than that. Some of them also very important figures. I want to mention these 5 because these 5 did things that today we take for granted, but were actually innovations of such importance that you can't imagine Judaism today without what they did. You can't really even imagine it. Okay, so let's go. The first one is Noahide. He was the Goyen of Pomadisa. He died in the year 761, but he was going for like almost, for many, many generations. I'm not clear about the date that it has here. His major work, although they all taught the Talmud, obviously, in the yeshivas they taught the Talmud, but his major thing was in halacha. His work is called the Shaltos. I have it here, by the way. What is a Shaltos? Shaltos means questions. In this time, the center of authority was there, but there were communities in all over. There were communities from the exiles who were in Italy who went into Germany and France, which was called Roman Gaul, and they were still there. There were exiles who were in Spain, North Africa, and other places. What did they do when they had questions? They didn't call a rabbi on a phone. They couldn't do that. They didn't have the internet to email somebody. They sent letters. They asked questions. And the rabbis, the geonim and the yeshiva would answer these questions. This is the start of the what we would call today the response to literature. Other geonim had it, but the Shaltos is a work specifically set up with these kinds of questions and answers. And that's really the first instance we have of what comes to be called today the response to literature. Questions asked to rabbis, and the rabbis answer it, and they become authoritative. Okay? This goes from back to the time of the geonim. We're talking about 761, the middle of the 8th century. And until today, that exists. I have on my shelf responsive works from many rabbis in very different times. We're going to talk about a number of them over the time, those that are very significant in its part of Torah development. But this is really the original source we get of works of responsive. Okay? The next person I want to talk about, who was his contemporary, but he was a Goyen of Sur, Noahide Goyen. He wrote another work. It was called Hilchos Gedolos. What he did, when people would ask questions, he compiled it into a book of Jewish law, very much like what we're going to later find eventually in the Shulchan Aruch, but there were many other works like that written over the period of time, compilations of Jewish law. But the first one we know of was called Hilchos Gedolos by Noahide Goyen, okay, in the middle of the 8th century. That type of writing never existed before. People learn from the Talmud, but this is the first time somebody's writing down what the laws are in a component, in one place, and it's there for people to look at. The next Goyen I want to talk about is another one who's very important. His name was Amram Goyen. He was a Goyen of Sur, and he died around 875. He was going there for about 20 years. Okay. Now again, people from faraway places were sending questions what to do. So they sent a question from Spain to him as the Gaon of Surah and asked him, what's the order of prayers we should do? Now the Talmud talks about orders of prayer in Masechtas Bruchos, talks about what you pray, the Kriya Shema, the blessings before and afterwards, but it gives a lot of things, but it doesn't really give a lot of the meat that comes into now. Amram Goyen was the first one to write a actual siddur. The siddur of Amram Goyen is the first siddur that we know of. Now, people prayed; they had a leader of prayers, and the prayers were based on the Talmud, but it wasn't really as formulated as it was. With Amram Goyen, and after that, we now have a order of prayer, which we call Nusach. Okay, he sent this to Spain. Similar things happened in Germany and other places, and we will find minor differences later on. But the point of the matter is, the first siddur we know of was Amun, and that is in the 9th century, from the Gaon of Sur. When you look at a siddur, a Jewish siddur, on the shelf, you have to think that is based essentially going back to what a Gaon over 1,200 years ago, a siddur that he wrote to Spain. Whatever differences there might be, that goes back to then. And that was the first time they had that. Before that, there were different things that people had, but there wasn't really none of that. That was really the first siddur. The next person is probably the one that you do know. He was the Gaon in Surah. This is Saadia Gaon. Okay, Saadia Gaon was going for about 20 years, a lot of turmoil. He was deposed, he was back and forth. There were a lot of political things going on there. He wrote a number of works. He wrote polemical works against the Karaites. He wrote biblical commentaries. He wrote halachic works. But what he's important of that makes him different from many of the others were two things. Number one, he was the first Gaon that I know who actually traveled outside of Persia, outside of his yeshiva Surah, and went to meet the people and go around amongst them. That was not known before. Very much like Hasidic rabbis, going out to people. And secondly, most important, he wrote a work on philosophy, explaining, the principles of Judaism in a philosophical manner. It's called Amina V'Dayas. Amina with faith, and Dayas is religion or beliefs or something like that. Hard to translate those words, but this is the first book, the first cipher on Jewish theology, what Judaism believes. Until that time, we never had a book, never had to write anything. Saadia Gaon was the first one who wrote one. Okay, and the reason, of course, is because of with the Muslims and the Christians, contending about Judaism. So he had to write down, this is what we believe and what we don't believe. Fundamentally, if you look at the Rambam, you'll see that his 13 principles all could be pretty much found there. And when we're going to have a session on Noahides and religion, which I'm going to talk about beliefs that Noahides should have. There's no real actual requirement in the 7. There's implications in the 7th about believing in God, but we're going to talk about the beliefs that Judaism holds to be true, that a Noahide should certainly believe them because they are true. Okay, so that was Saadia Gaon, and he wrote it, and basically his is a fundamental work that Rambam and all those other people eventually were going to write what the fundamentals of Judaism wrote, basically are following up in what he said. The final Gaon I'm going to talk about is Rabbi Gaon. He was the last one. He died around 1040. He was the last one. He wrote responsive literature and all kinds of things, but he was the last of the Geonim. Okay, he wrote all kinds of commentaries. He was the last one. And now, interesting enough, you should know that today are living many Jewish people descended from him. There was a famous rabbi in the city of Prague, Maro in Prague, who was descended from Rabbi Gaon, and those who are descended from Rabbi Gaon, from the Maharal or one of his brothers or something like that, are descendants of Rabbi Gaon. Rabbi Gaon, his father wrote his ancestry, whose father was Shirita Gaon, was also Gaon. So he traces his ancestry all about to the kings of the heads of the exile, who were basically from the royal line, going back to King David. Okay, so he listened. Another interesting fact, you should know, we mentioned Hillel. So we have a lot of people walking around today who are actually descendants of the kings of Judah because of the descendant of Gaon. And also Rashi, very well known. Rashi was the 37th generation from a rabbi in the Talmud who I didn't mention, Yochanan Sandler, not because he wasn't great, but because he's not. I can't mention every single rabbi, so I had to choose out which one. Yochanan Sandler. Yochanan Sandler was the 4th generation from Gamliel. Gamliel was descended from Hillel. So those people are descended from Rashi, which is a huge amount of people, are descended from Hillel and Gamliel, by the way. As I've said many times, I always ask missionaries, name me anybody who in the New Testament who has descendants alive today. And the only one who has descendants alive today that you can point to is Gamliel. Okay, so we're coming to the end of this period, and we're going to be starting a new period. But to introduce this new period, in the 11th century, in 1040, the yeshivas in certain Parmesan closed. What was happening at that time was that there was turmoil in Persia and the Middle East because the Seljuk Turks came in and started conquering the area. So the government's Abbasid kingdom in that area collapsed. Things were in a turmoil, and the yeshivas eventually ended up closing. But Hashem prepared before that time that people should go on. So we should understand that while the center of authority was in Babylonia, there was building up in other areas where Jewish people lived, authorities that from that they're going to be able to build the foundation for authority instead of being in a single place, but a dispersed authority in different areas, France, Germany, Spain, and North Africa, which is going to be discussed about more in the next session. So let me first mention rabbis from the time of the geonim who lived in different places. That's important. In North Africa, there was a rabbi named Danish ben Lebrat. He was primarily known for, he wrote religious poetry. And in fact, even to today, we read his, sing his religious poetry on Shabbos. For example, in my community, we sing a poem called Dror Yikra, which he wrote. The first letters Beladanish. He wrote that. Okay, so 1,000 years after him, we are still singing his poetry, and that became something that was very common. Religious poetry became extremely common, and we talked about Amnon Gohan with his siddur. Many of the religious poetry from that time became incorporated into the siddurim in different places, whether in Germany or in other places, developed their own separate type of prayers that they have, bringing in this religious poetry from that time. Okay. Also in Spain, another person from this part, also in the 10th century, was Menachem ben Sirach. Menachem ben Sirach was grammarian. Okay. And he's very important for biblical commentary. He lived in Spain. And if you learn Rashi, when Rashi discusses grammatical things, you will see many times he says, Menachem ben Sirach says so and so and so and so. This is that Menachem ben Sirach, who was a grammarian in Spain. Spain had many people of learning, but it wasn't yet on the level of what was in Babylonia. I mean, after the end of Geonim, there was also a change in, again, a lowering of the standards, just like there was a lowering in standards at the Talmud. There was a lowering in standards, but each of the community was devolved authority into different areas, which we're going to go into much more detail in the next session here. The third person I want to talk about is Shimon Agulo, who lived in Germany, again, in the same time, roughly corresponding with Rabbi Gohan. He was a Talmud, and he was taught Talmud himself. He was a Rosh Hashiva there, and he taught people who became like the rabbis of Rashi, for example, were from the students of his. He was the center of starting the yeshiva movement in yeshivas in there. He was one of the big ones. And another person important to know was Colonimus of Lucca. Lucca was a city in Spain. The Colonimus family was a very important family in Germany, of German Jews, the Colonimus family. Many important people are descended from the Colonimus family. I believe Rabbi Huda Husid in the 12th century, I believe, was from the Colonimus family. So Colonimus of Lucca came there. He came to Germany. The story is told that Charlemagne invited him to come to Germany, and he settled in the city of Mainz. Mainz was a city of Torah learning. Again, the authority was still in Babylonia, but there was still Torah learning outside of it, and people were learning. And he basically founded, Mainz was one of the primary cities of Torah learning in Germany after the end of the Geonim. That's where German Judaism starts, from the city of Mainz. Okay, now another important point, again, as they were the authority in Persia, Babylonia, Persia, was ending with the invasion of the Seljuk Turks. There were 4 rabbis who were sent to go around to visit communities, and they were captured by by Muslim pirates. And as was the custom, the Muslims would capture people on ships, and they would sell them into slavery. Okay, so what they did is they went from port to port, selling these rabbis to the communities there, and these rabbis became the foundation of bringing the Torah learning from Babylonia to other places. Okay, so there were four of them. The first one mentioned is Moshe ben Chanoch. He went to Spain, the city specifically of Cordova, again in the middle of the 10th century. And he is the foundation of the Torah learning in that area. Shmaya ben Elchanan was in Egypt. He died around year 1000. He was in the city of Alexandria. Rabbi Chashiel went to Tunisia, North Africa, Morocco. Those areas like that were influenced from there. And finally, there's a fourth one whose name we don't know, but he ended up being redeemed in Italy, I believe in Rome. And so he brought to there the learning from Babylonia. And these were catalysts to bridge from the authority from Babylonia, moving to a dispersed authority in areas like Spain, Germany, and North Africa, which we're going to do in the next time we get together. We're going to discuss these various different areas. Okay, that's what I want to cover. Basically, what we're coming here is from Moshe, central authority going from time to time, moving around from Babylonia to Israel, from Israel back to Babylonia and Persia, until it finally ends in the 11th century with the closing of the yeshivas in Babylonia and Persia, in Sur and Paditza, and then the authority starting to move to other places, Germany, Spain, and North Africa. And we're going to discuss about these people. The next generation we call the Rishonim, the first ones. And again, just like we saw before, the Rishonim have no authority to disagree with the previous generations. They can only say that they disagree with this one or that one, and these kinds of views. Again, in recognition that because of the social situation having changed significantly, it's a recognition that they have no authority to oppose what was in previous generations. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Are there any questions?
I don't have any online, Rabbi. Does anybody in the group have any questions they want to ask the Rabbi?
Any questions whatsoever? I know it's a lot of stuff we went through. We covered a long period of history and some events.
I just find it amazing that there's so many scrolls that they had to keep up with and travel with. You know?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting question in the future. We'll discuss about it more in the future. But yes, they did. The Talmud, everything, yeah. They wrote down the Talmud because they had to, and yeah, we have collections of all these types of things.
Yeah, and y'all still have them.
Yeah. We're going to discuss about it when we get to Rishonim and stuff like that. We'll discuss more about the text itself. Okay. I just want you to be aware that we don't believe in sola scriptura, whether it has to do with the Talmud, the Mishnah, or even the biblical text. Okay. We don't, believe in such thing. The concept of inerrancy of the Talmud is non-existent. Okay. We have our authorities. Our authorities are the ones who make decisions based on the best information they have. Okay. It's a very important to understand. That was what the point of last time was, to recognize that the importance to Hashem is that we have authorities and follow them. They're the ones who decide what it should be. It's what Hashem wants is obedience. Hashem is less interested in what you're doing as, are you obedient? Are you following the system he says he wants you to follow? If you're obedient to the system, you're obedient to Hashem. And that's all that matters.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, that's what the whole point. We're trying to trace this authority down to our present time. We've gotten to the 11th century, where is essentially the end of a single central authority. Now, the Talmud, yes, there's disagreements in different areas. We find in the Talmud different rabbis disagree in different areas. We see a lot of places where it talks to the Mishnah that in the Galil they did it one way, and Yehuda they did it, Judea they did it a different way. These things, yes, there were always these kinds of differences. But the point is as far as central authority, like I mentioned, what's talking about deciding when the new moon is. was in Jerusalem. They had the authority for that. When we're talking about the concept, where the central, where's the places we go to? I mean, even in Babylonia, they had two yeshivas and the differences between the two yeshivas. But again, they were a central authority in a certain area. It was just different two yeshivas that had authorities. Okay. The centralization. As we're going on, from this time on, we're going to see decentralization. And this decentralization will bring about the situation of what Judaism looks like today. Authority, rather being in one central place, is devolved into different areas. Okay, so instead of having two yeshivas, each one having authority, we'll not have different geographical areas, and they have their authority there. We'll begin to talk about the customs of Ashkenaz, the custom of Sfard. These all start happening because the authority has now devolved into different areas, having no longer being centrally located in one region, in one area. Even though there may be differences there, but it's no longer a single area. It's now more devolved and more spread out. But essentially, we're still following the same system we talked about last time. Rabbinic authority based on traditions going back, and the differences come about when questions come up and various other things question how we're going to deal with certain situations, which were not discussed specifically in the Talmud or have not been decided specifically in the Talmud when they have to decide what to do. Again, the authority has started to be spread around. And yes, scrolls, writing. Remember, by this time they did have books, okay? Scrolls, the reason why the Tanakh was written in scrolls because they didn't have books. Books started coming into, I think, 2nd, 3rd century. I'm not really an expert on this, but I think by the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, they actually had books, okay? So things were starting to be written down in books. And books are a little bit easier to take around than scrolls, obviously. But they were written in that. The Talmud was written in the book, was not written in scroll. So, that's the way it was. We'll see. The learning was, once things were written on books, you had to copy books, but it was much easier.
You can get more in a book.
Yeah, it's much easier to carry around the book than it is to carry around a scroll. A scroll of the Torah, a Torah scroll is quite, difficult to carry around, whereas a book of a Chumash of the Torah is much easier.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions?
It's going to be interesting when you talk about choosing a rabbi and knowing what the rabbi is a rabbi of.
Yeah, well, again, let's wait till we actually get to it. It's important to know what, when we're talking about authority. The title rabbi is not important. The title of authority we're going to find is much more important. Again,
We don't have to go in it now.
Once we get to present day, we'll discuss and you understand what I'm talking about. There are, what's important is this person an authority on the subject or not? When we get to today, okay? We'll get to that. Again, we're now getting to the part where authority and learning is now being dispersed into different areas and different things start happening. People approach problems differently in different areas. So we're going to start to see, more difference than there was before.
An old question.
Sure.
Did the Essenes live separately than the Pharisees? Did they have their communities away from each other?
I'm not quite sure about that. There is assumed that in Qumran was a community of Essenes. Josephus, when he talks about it, says he went to the desert to meet the Essenes. So it seems that they tried to separate from the general community and live their lives in separate communities. Okay. I mean, well, look at it today. The Hasidim live in separate communities. They sort of self-segregate. Okay. So, it is, except for Lubavitch, by the way, but most Hasidim lived in segregated communities like Borough Park, Williamsburg, in Muncie, in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, in certain areas of Yerushalayim where specifically, they sort of self-segregate. So these scenes were not much different than that. What I try and do when I discuss it in my counter-mission stuff is to understand the scenes, they had some strange views, but they're really not so far out from the Pharisees. Okay, the Pharisees believed the Mashiach would come at any time and stuff like that. It wasn't different, but the scenes were extreme in that. They didn't, we say what the Rambam says, that we believe the Mashiach can come any time, and if it takes time, we're going to wait for it. And the scenes are like, no, we're not going to wait. He's coming right now, and we don't think he's going to wait anything to wait it for. Okay, so it's not that they don't agree they don't disagree that Mashiach is supposed to come, or even a lot of things that are going to happen. It's just whether you say, okay, we hope he's going to come now, we believe he's going to come now, but maybe he won't, so we'll just wait anyways. The scenes were more like scenes from the literature, more like he's coming, and don't talk to me about him coming later. He's coming right now. Okay, these are people who are apocalyptic. Okay, so whether they believe it's really now, but fundamentally the beliefs aren't different. It's just whether they were apocalyptic about it, or whether they were not apocalyptic about it. We'll discuss. This is a discussion we could talk about also sometime. Maybe when we talk about Noahide and religion, we'll talk about this concept of apocalypticism. For example, in the Lubavitch, you really have to talk to them a lot now as being apocalyptic, and they believe in the imminence of Mashiach, and they don't accept the concept that maybe he won't come. Whereas the rest of Jewish people believe in the imminence of Mashiach coming, but like Ram was saying, if he doesn't come, then he doesn't come. Hashem doesn't want him to come, so he'll come when he comes. But we believe he could come every day. It's just it's not really relevant to what we're talking about now, rabbinic authority and Noahides and rabbis, but it's the more you know as a Noahide about Jewish communities and what the Jewish rabbis and Jewish people are like, it'll be much, much helpful for you in not just being adjusted. Also, it's going to lead to what is again another one of my goals is to see that as many Noahides as possible should be living the kind of life that they would be accepted by all Jews. Okay, not just by the Jews who are interested in the Noahide movement, but that all Jews would be able to see that, oh, these people are really serious. They understand what Judaism is about. They understand, what being a Noahide was about, and they have goals and things like that. And they can fit in as part of, those people who worship Hashem as Noahides. Okay, that's the bottom line goal is what I have. Okay, that's why some things I don't emphasize as much, but it's one reason why this is very important right now is under rabbis and Noahides and rabbis, because the tradition where it comes down to is going to help you in the long run to understand, oh, now I understand what the Jewish world is like. What it's about, why these people are different, where they come from, their traditions are different, why the people in the Sephardim just, why when I see Rabbi Shulman after Shabbos, he's wearing this funny fur hat. Why does he do that when my Lubavitcher friends don't wear that? Okay. All of these things, we're eventually going to get to that so that you really have a much more intimate knowledge of the Jewish world. And so that you as a Noahide will, be able to, first of all, not walk into a shul where you're not going to be, get a very cold to negative reception. So you shouldn't feel really bad about it and understand why such things happen. And even to know how to get to, see different things. Again, it's a process. It's getting away from certain paradigms and understanding the paradigm of the Jewish people and understanding the Jewish traditions and how it goes from generation to generation like this is part of understanding the Jewish paradigm.
Yeah,
and this affects
rounded.
and this affects Noahides because again, the Noahide laws are part of that Jewish tradition. Okay, it exists within it, and so in order to understand, you have to really understand what this tradition is, and when we start talking about the Rambam says this, this is where he comes in. Oh, this is what he's. Oh, this agreement. This rabbi says this because he comes from these lands, and this is why they held this way. But if he came from this land, it would be different. Or, like in my case, when it comes to Jewish law for Noahides, I look at everybody all over the world. So if it's something that, say, in one part they rule, the majority in that area will rule in a certain way, but everybody else in the other area, and if we look at the whole picture of all the rabbis, we see the overall majority looks at things and accepts a certain way, then I will follow the overall majority as the way that I think you should act. Okay? Whereas we'll come to something when we come to religion, Noahides, and a few other places. We're going to come to some things like that you understand. But knowing this tradition and knowing exactly specifically what we're going to do in the next session, how authority becomes dispersed in different areas and how these different areas develop, and the works that are developed in those areas is going to help you very much to understand what's going on in this world. Even if you're looking, for example, the Divine Code, and you see him quoting from different works, you know where these works, where they came from, where their traditions come from, what's going on, the different things like that. It's very important as far as a background type of information. It may be boring for some of you. I'm trying to balance between history and just giving you names and importance, but it's important to know the development, okay, and how it comes about.
Wasn't the Mishnah passed down orally, like from Moses and down through the generations?
The Mishnah was passed on orally. The laws themselves, what to do, mostly go back to Moses. But again, there's certain things we know. For example, with Purim and Hanukkah, which we find mentioned. There's a whole tractate in Megillah dealing with laws of Purim. That doesn't go back to Moshe. Okay, that starts from an historical event in the Book of Esther. That whole tractate is from that. Okay.
Wasn't Mordecai one of the teachers that would pass it down?
Yes, but Mordecai lived in Persia.
Okay.
In the Persian exile. That's after the Babylonian exile, after the destruction of the first temple. Yeah. Okay, we're talking about a period of time, hundreds and hundreds of years after Moshe. Now we have a belief, a tradition, something that we can't prove, that Moshe, when he was on Mount Sinai for 40 days, during that time, there's midrashim that say that Hashem showed to Moshe and what later generations rabbis would be teaching. He didn't hand them down. He didn't come down, hey, in such and such a year, this person's going to teach it. No, he was shown that, and he was told what he was supposed to teach to the people, and known what was later going to happen in the future. Okay, that's a belief that we have. If you don't want to believe it, I can't say there's anything wrong with that. It's a belief. I believe that's possibly true. When you have a good teacher like Hashem, you can learn a lot very quickly. Okay, so it's possible. But again, this, Hanukkah and Purim, which appear in both the Talmud and in the Mishnah, Purim in the Mishnah and Hanukkah in the Talmud, these were all things that are part of our tradition that comes down. Okay, very important. These are background things that you have to know with Noahide. In Christianity, we never taught that. I've never met a missionary, for example, who actually understood when we talk about the oral law what it really means.
Right.
Okay, when we're talking about oral tradition and oral rabbinic authority that entails Hanukkah and Purim and other things which are long past Moshe, but we consider all part of our oral law.
I was 35 years old before I knew there was a Tanakh. Yeah. In 86. Well, 85, I was 35, but my Tanakh is I got it in 86. But the Christians I didn't even know it existed.
Christians in general, from my experience, really have no clue. I mean, for example, we talked about the Pharisees being Judaism. You cannot understand in Matthew when he talks about the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. If you don't understand, and in fact, what he's saying is, hey, the Pharisees, they are Judaism. Okay, that's real authentic Judaism tradition. That's really what it is. You got to deal with it.
Yeah.
Okay? That's basically what he's telling. And if you don't really understand Josephus and what's going on, then in fact, Pharisee means Jewish, means Orthodox Jew. Okay, that's what it means. In our terms now, it's anachronistic to use the term Orthodox Jew to say Pharisees were Orthodox Jews. Just like it's anachronistic to call the Pharisees rabbis, but essentially that's what they were. It's just the name that changed afterwards.
I heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the terms that we use now don't necessarily aren't the same term they used then, but they denote people fulfilling a certain function that was the same function. The Pharisees functioned as rabbis do later on. And essentially everybody followed the rabbis because that was what Judaism was. Just like people followed the rabbis because that's what Judaism is.
Great class.
Yeah. So again, these are important for a number of reasons. Choose how Noahides can understand who a rabbi that they want to follow, and just basically understand where does this all figure in? Judaism where is this all coming from? Okay. And Noahide laws is like a very, 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 very small part of the whole picture there. Okay, but it's there. It's a significant part. It takes up a number of pages in the Tractate Sanhedrin. It appears in many other sources, which will, some of these things will come up. It's a source that's in there. It's there. It's part of the Jewish tradition. It comes around from the Jewish authority, from the Talmud and further. But it is a small part of it. The vast majority of Jewish learning is not things that apply to Noahides. Okay, but again, when we start going more about rabbis, we'll get back into it about putting it more in a practical how you're supposed to do it. But it's important to realize that this is an actual tradition. This is actually where the authority is in real life. Okay, not the theory of what we talk about. Okay, but in actual real life, how it is and how we see it actually goes. Again, until the 11th century, and actually having from single centers of authority until the 11th century, where we have a diversified authority into different areas. I'm always following the same principles of rabbinic authority, but now being more diversified than it was before. Not that the word was homogeneous, it was always heterogeneous type of views within Judaism, different views, and even some different views were acceptable. But now with the dispersion, it becomes more heterogeneous ideas that are acceptable under rabbinic authority. That's where this is actually coming from. Again, the next time we do
Well
it,
said,
we're going
yeah.
we're going to go through a lot of names of rabbis. Many of them you've heard of. Some of you haven't, but I mentioned, just like I mentioned rabbis, the geonim that are important. You should know who they are or the names, but in order to give you an idea of how this actual tradition went from generation to generation. Okay, and where do I fit in as a person? Okay, I belong to where do we go back to this? And you can actually, no matter which community, from Orthodox community, you can go back to where you start attaching to a chain which goes back from generation to generation to generation, all the way back to the Talmud, to the Mishnah, all the way back to Moshe. Going back. But we're going from one end to the other, but you're going to see how once it goes off, spreads out in different places, they essentially all come back. So, for example, we all go back to the geonim that were in Surim Pumbedisa. And the geonim go back to Babylonia, where the Babylonian Talmud was written, and they go back to Israel, before where the Mishnah was, and they go back before that all the way back to the men of the Great Assembly, which is where they came together to organize things after destruction. And that goes back to the Nevi'im, go back to the Zechariah, go back to Yeshua, go back to Moshe. All of these things are a chain of time going up and down. You can go from each way. We're going from the beginning to the end. And then once you get to the end, you're going to see, oh, this is where these people, oh, this is why you like this is why. We're going to see a lot of the same types of themes that we say where persecutions affecting, the Jewish people. We're going to see how, again, persecutions in these periods of time, the persecutions that we're going to talk about affected, again, where Jewish authority is. Like, I will tell you right now, one of the first questions we're going to ask in the next time is, how did it come about that Poland and Russia became the center of Jewish authority in Europe? We know that from the time of the exile, it was in Germany, city of Mainz. Another city was Shapiro. Anybody named Shapiro came to the city of Speyer in Germany. Okay, Worms in Germany. These were the centers of Judaism in Germany, the year 1000, and even for a while after that. How did they end up being in Poland? How come Poland, by the World War II, was the center of European Jewry? The overwhelming majority of authorities of Jews lived in Russia and Poland. Some in Hungary, a little less there, but still Eastern Europe. How did they get into Eastern Europe when they were all in Germany? That's going to be next time. We're going to see how we get to there and how are the Jews I'm getting long-winded now. I see that Dan wants us to wind down on this, which is right. I want to wind down also. So how we actually get to these things is what we're going to really do next time. Okay. So
thank you, Dan.
If there's no questions, I'm going to stop the recording. 1,
All
2.
right. Well, thank you
Fine.
so much,
Recording
Rabbi Shulman.
stopped.
Excellent
Okay, just
session.
quick. Yeah. Now
Very,
I want to
very
mention. I want to
informative to help.
mention. Yeah, I want to
Go-
mention that the next session, I'm not sure when it's going to be. I'm going to Israel on Tuesday, and I'm going to be meeting some people in Israel there. No one here lives in Israel, so I guess I won't get to visit you there. But I've got a pretty full schedule of people who want to meet with me about various issues, from Noahide issues and also my counter-missionary issues. People there also are meeting on both of these things. So it takes up pretty much a lot of my time.
So more rabbis are sharpening up on the Noahide.
I'm not quite sure about it outside of, let's wait till we get down there, because I want to explain exactly what's going on so you have more of an understanding. It's much more complicated than that. The world of rabbis, as Noahides know, is an extremely small part of actual Orthodox Judaism. And I want you to know what Orthodox Judaism is like. We'll follow the history down, what Judaism is like. And then we'll give you ideas of people who are more open to it and less open to it. Give an idea of what's going on. This is, this is something that's, again, it's in the future. Okay. We have to get there. Okay. It's okay. I know it takes a long time, but I really want this to be a full understanding, because, you have dedicated your lives to living a certain way, and you deserve to be given a clear understanding of what the world is like that you're, being a part of. I mean, even though you're not following Judaism, you are essentially associated with the Torah way of life, okay, as a Noahide. So you should know where the authority comes from, where everything comes. You should have an awareness of it, okay? Mm-hmm. And then this rabbi comes from this tradition. This is why he has these types of views. It's based on this. And this rabbi is like this way, when
that
you get
falls
to understand,
back to authority.
Yeah, but again, you're now that we're having this split, after the yeshivas closed in Persia, Sur Hamadisa, and we see the dispersion of authority, we're going to start beginning to get ideas which are going to resonate and relate to today. So, for example, the overwhelming majority of people who are involved in Noahides, I mean, I think, if not 100%, but pretty close to 100%, are actually from Ashkenaz. Jews whose ancestors were in Europe. Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna shut up.
I don't know any Sephardim who are involved. Although there are Sephardic works which do mention, Rabbinic was a Sephard. The author of the Shulman was Sephard, but mostly discussions are now people from Ashkenaz. Again, my approach has always been that I try to ignore the fact that in Ashkenaz they held certain ways, and try to keep to views which would be as close to universal, as close to the majority as possible, when I know that there's disagreements about some things. I try and follow the majority, not the view that's specifically in Ashkenaz. It's going to come out when we talk about Noahides and rabbis. This is going to come out later on when we consider specific issues. But again, that's my personal approach to it, because I think that that's the correct and proper approach nowadays. But you're going to see what's happening. You find that the rabbis who are involved are all Ashkenazim, essentially. Chassidim Ashkenazim, essentially there. And our tradition goes back to Ashkenaz. It doesn't go back to Sfar. Okay. Again, part of this is to give you a background, get you to have a feeling comfortable things. I mentioned this earlier that one of the things in Israel, I've spoken to people, I floated the idea, is that I would really like to organize a Noahide tour of Israel. What would make it different is we'd go to the Kaisa, we'd go to the Cave of the Patriarchs and stuff like that, but we would spend time also visiting the many grave sites of important people that are relevant to Noahide. For example, Maimonides, you may not know, is buried in Tiberias, in Tiberia. You can visit where he's buried there. Rabbi Akiva is not far from there. Other rabbis who have a certain significance in the chain of rabbinic authority, and also because of that have a certain direct relationship to his Noahides, are all buried there. These are real people. They're real gravesites. Hillel is buried in Meron. Okay? There are a number of rabbis buried in Sfas. rabbis who came to Israel after leaving Spain and when the Ottoman Empire allowed them. These are all things that for Noahide should give you a more idea. I'm discussing different ones that would be important, rabbis from the Talmud, others, people who you know of their names, and by doing that, this type of tour would make these people have a certain reality for you that looking at a book doesn't have. I told the story to some early to another session, is that when I went to Europe to visit the grave sites there, and I went to the city of Krakow, which is in Poland right now. And there's a very famous synagogue there called the Shul from Moshe Israelis. We'll come to him next time. And in that cemetery is buried a number of famous rabbis, the Moshe Israel, the Bach, we'll talk about him later on, Tosfos Yontiv, and a bunch of other people whose Sforim are on my bookcase right now. So that nowadays, since I've been there, whenever I open it up and I read the Lemur, what he writes, I remember this is a real person. I saw his synagogue. I saw where he's buried. Or if I see the Bach when I'm reading the Torah Shulchan, the Bach, I saw where he was buried. These are real people. Okay,
Yeah, make it real.
These are real, and I feel that for Noahides, this would be very, very spiritually uplifting to see we're dealing with the real world. Christianity can't do that. You can't say, hey, let's take a Christian tour. We're going to see where Paul is buried and where Peter is buried and Matthew is buried. No, we can't say it. Okay,
because that doesn't only exist.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. These are characters in the book, but Maimonides, these are real people. We know where they're buried, and many of the names of the people that we're going to mention, some of them actually are buried in Israel. Nachmanides is buried in Israel. There's a contention about where he was buried, and people, and these are very important as far as for Jews are concerned. That's why we visit. One of the reasons to visit the grave sites, because these people were holy people, so there's a certain degree of holiness there, and also remind you, hey, these are real people. They were flesh and blood and lived just like us. These are not imaginary things. These are not things that are in a book that we have no idea what this is real. So I have somebody I mentioned to, I've quoted this idea a few times. Maybe, within a year or so, maybe we might be able to have such a tour, which would go to Israel and go to all these sites, spend a certain time seeing and just getting the feeling of the reality of what we're dealing with, the Jewish tradition. Okay, something you can never get from Christianity. All the Christian sites you visit are, either places that are Jewish sites or, things that, supposedly Jesus was here, but we don't see any, his footsteps aren't here. He's not buried here. We don't do anything that. When you get a Jewish site, these people are buried there. Okay, it's something that I have in the back of my mind. I have people I'm talking to. Maybe we'll formulate it in a certain amount of time. I have no idea what it'll take. But once we get some formulation and discussion, and I see if people are really, willing to do it, then we might actually do something like that. But again, the point is I'm trying to make this as a reality. Okay, we're not talking about names in books. These are real people. Rabbi has descendants to Hillel, Gamliel. They have real live descendants living today who can trace themselves back to him.
Beautiful.
Okay, these are not, Judaism is something that's real. Okay, and coming from a Christian background, you don't have that kind of a thing. Okay. Anyways, every session when we end, we always talk. Dan, I take it you're recording it, but I don't record it because I don't think it's really part of it. This is just talking together. It's one of your advantages of coming to Zoom sessions. You get to sit and talk with me.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay?
Well, Rabbi, it's been beautiful series so far, and I love the theme. It's not just a walk down memory lane. You're establishing the credentials and the authority line, but it also fills in gaps for us for sure, which allow us to actually have bearings for sure. So thank you so much for that. And we wish you, we're praying for your safety on your trip to Israel this week. May you have a blessed time and be a blessing as you always are. And so there's a small chance we may have another session the end of March. There's a small chance.
Small chance. It's a difficult time. I'm coming back just before Purim, so
Right.
that Sunday is Purim, and then the next week is possibly in March. April's going to be a problem with you, and
Yeah.
April's really getting into Passover. Passover is a very big, very difficult time. Always very busy. So again, we'll just take it play it by ear. It may be May will be the next session. Certainly May will be. I mean, let's put it this way: the information that I'm going to give, I have basically completed. I may add some final touches when I'm in Israel. I'll have a little bit of time to add it, but essentially the material is finished. Okay.
Beautiful.
So it's just a question of when is it going to be that we can actually work it out of a Sunday where I could actually do it.
Well,
Because in
have
Israel,
a safe
I would
trip.
love to do it in Israel, but the problem is because of the time.
Plus the internet is not the most stable coming out of Israel. Sometimes it's very poor bandwidth or low bandwidth. But we do the best with what we have, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to do these and prepare them and inform. And so we hope that everybody's enjoyed it. And my wife's waiting for me to take her out for dinner. So,
well, you should have told me that's what you're waiting for. I think you were waiting for.
I told her we'd be done by 6 p.m. my time, and it's almost 20 after, and I can hear the pots and pans clanging downstairs.
You should have told me. You should have told me that we were taking your wife out for dinner. I would have stopped at 9 o'clock on the dot.
Well.
Okay. Anyways, okay. Dan, why don't you close? Dan, why don't you close it up so that it starts downloading the recordings?
Okay. On that note, we're going to sign out with the stream. So until our next session, have a wonderful, wonderful week, everybody. Bye for now.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.